Welcome to Blind History with Josh Berry. Over the next few weeks, we will be diving into the history of Egypt. Here is the full article, Part 2. Early Dynastic and Old Kingdom, circa 3100 through 2181 BCE. From Predynastic Chiefs to Pharaohs. By around 3100 BCE, Egypt had transformed from a patchwork of competing regional chieftains into a single kingdom ruled by a pharaoh. This shift did not happen overnight. It was the culmination of the pre-dynastic trends you saw in Part 1. Growing social hierarchies, intensifying warfare, expanding trade, and the development of shared symbols of authority. In this new order, the king was not just a political leader, but a sacred figure, whose authority linked the human realm to the gods and to the cosmic order. Later Egyptian tradition remembered a figure named Menes as the founder of the unified state, though historians debate whether this name refers to a single person, a title, or a composite memory of several early rulers. Archaeological evidence points to kings like Narmer and his successors as key actors in bringing Upper and Lower Egypt under one crown. In any case, the result was a new political structure, a centralized monarchy able to mobilize resources from the entire Nile Valley. This new kingship was ideologically charged. The pharaoh was seen as the guarantor of maat, order, balance, and justice, against the forces of chaos that threatened both nature and society. To uphold maat, the king had to perform rituals, lead or authorize military campaigns, oversee law and administration, and ensure that the gods received proper offerings. The state that grew around this figure was, therefore, as much a religious institution as a political one. The structure of the early dynastic state. The early dynastic period is usually defined as the first and second dynasties, roughly from 3100 to 2700 BCE. During these centuries, the basic framework of the Egyptian state took shape. The king sat at the apex, supported by a growing administrative apparatus that extended down through provincial officials to village-level authorities. The country was divided into nomes, or districts, each with its own local cults and traditions, but now integrated into the larger system. Local leaders and priests owed allegiance to the pharaoh, who in turn recognized their roles within the broader hierarchy. Over time, scribes, specialists in the newly developed writing system, became essential intermediaries, recording taxes, land ownership, deliveries of goods, and religious dedications. Writing, still in its relatively early stages, was primarily a tool of power. It appeared on labels, stone monuments, seals, and ceremonial objects associated with the king and his officials. The script combined pictorial signs with phonetic values, making it possible to record names, titles, and short statements. As the system matured, it allowed the state to keep more detailed records and thereby manage resources more effectively. The capital during the early dynastic period is generally associated with Memphis, near the apex of the Nile Delta. From this position, the king and his court could oversee both Upper and Lower Egypt and control traffic along the river. Memphis became a political and logistical hub, while royal burial centers in Upper Egypt, such as Abydos, retained their importance as sacred and ancestral sites. Royal tombs and the cult of the king. Royal tombs from the early dynastic period offer some of the clearest evidence for how the institution of kingship was understood. At Abydos, large rectangular tombs of mud brick and wood, often with multiple chambers, housed the remains of kings and their grave goods. Nearby, separate enclosures may have been used for funerary rituals or as symbolic palaces where the king's presence was maintained after death. These tombs were far more elaborate than those of the pre-dynastic elites. Their scale and construction required substantial manpower and coordination, showing that the king could command labor on a large scale. Grave goods included stone vessels, fine pottery, ritual objects, and materials imported from distant regions. Such items underscored the king's wealth, reach, and role as an intermediary between Egypt and the wider world. A striking and disturbing feature of some early royal burials is the presence of subsidiary graves around the king's tomb. These may have contained retainers, servants, officials, or guards who died at or shortly after the king's burial. Whether they were sacrificed or volunteered is unclear, but their burial in association with the king suggests a belief that they would continue to serve him in the afterlife. Over time, this practice disappears, replaced by other ways of representing a royal entourage in the next world, such as small figurines. The king's burial was not just a personal affair, it had a collective dimension. The entire country was expected to contribute in the form of goods, labor, and ritual observances. In this way, royal funerals and the ongoing cult of dead kings helped knit the kingdom together, reinforcing the idea that all Egyptians shared in the fate and sacred destiny of their ruler. Everyday life under early dynastic rule. For the ordinary inhabitants of Egypt, farmers, herders, craftspeople, the early dynastic period meant living in a more organized hierarchical society than before. The state's ability to tax and conscript labor affected daily life, especially during planting and harvest seasons, and when large projects needed manpower. Most people continued to live in small villages, working the land in family units or local groups. They cultivated cereals, vegetables, and flax, tended cattle and other livestock, and fished or hunted where possible. Agricultural tools remained relatively simple, but organization improved. Irrigation basins, canals, and dikes required regular maintenance, likely coordinated by local officials acting under state authority. Craft production also became more specialized. Some individuals or families focused on pottery, stoneworking, weaving, or metalworking, supplying local needs and contributing to state projects. The presence of centralized workshops in or near administrative centers hints at controlled production for royal or temple use. In such contexts, craftspeople might work under the supervision of officials, turning their skills into a form of service to the king. Religiously, local cults persisted, but they increasingly intersected with the official ideology of the state. Villages would have had their own shrines and rituals, yet the king's role as chief priest of the land's major gods meant that his name and image appeared in religious contexts across Egypt. Festivals, processions, and offerings connected local sacred life to the central institution of kingship. The Old Kingdom and the Age of Pyramids. The Old Kingdom, traditionally covering dynasties 3 through 6, roughly 2700 2001 BCE, is often called the Age of Pyramids because of its spectacular royal tombs. It was also a period of institutional consolidation, cultural flourishing, and experimentation with ways of expressing royal power and divine order. Under the Third Dynasty, kings and their architects began to experiment with stone in new ways. The most famous example is the step pyramid complex at Saqqara, built for King Djoser. Designed by his architect Imhotep, this monument transformed an earlier, low rectangular structure into a series of stacked mastabas, creating the world's first large-scale stone pyramid. The surrounding complex included courtyards, chapels, and symbolic buildings, forming a complete ritual landscape for the king's afterlife. With the Fourth Dynasty, royal ambition reached even more monumental heights. At Giza, kings like Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure built the Great Pyramids and associated temples and causeways, along with the Great Sphinx. These constructions required unprecedented levels of organization, quarrying, transporting, and assembling massive stone blocks, feeding and housing thousands of workers, and coordinating a skilled workforce of planners, artisans, and managers. The pyramids were not merely tombs. They were cosmic symbols. Their shape may have evoked the rays of the sun, or the primeval mound emerging from the waters of chaos at creation. In this interpretation, the king's burial within the pyramid and his associated rituals linked him to the sun god and to the origin of the universe. The pyramid complexes, with their aligned causeways and temples, integrated astronomy, landscape, and theology into a single statement of royal identity. Administration, scribes, and provincial life in the Old Kingdom. To support such monumental projects and maintain control over a large territory, the Old Kingdom expanded and refined its administration. The king relied on a hierarchy of officials who held titles like vizier, overseer of works, overseer of granaries, and many others. These men, and occasional women, were often members of the royal family or closely connected elite families, forming a governing class centered at the capital, but extending into the provinces. Scribes played a crucial role in this system. They were trained to read and write hieroglyphs in the cursive script used on papyrus. Their tasks included recording harvests, managing storerooms, issuing orders, and documenting religious and legal matters. Literacy was limited, so scribes enjoyed high status and could advance through the ranks of administration, sometimes rising to very powerful positions. In the provinces, local officials represented the central state. They organized corvée labor, collected taxes in kind, grain, livestock, textiles, etc., and oversaw local justice. Over time, some provincial families amassed wealth and influence, building their own tombs and estates. Their inscriptions and statues provide valuable glimpses into provincial life, the layout of estates, relations between landowners and workers, and the integration of local and royal cults. For common people, the Old Kingdom brought both burdens and protections. The demands of the state were greater than before, particularly in terms of labor for building projects. At the same time, the stability provided by an effective administration, the regulation of irrigation, and the enforcement of royal law could offer a measure of security. In ideal terms, the king's upholding of maat meant ensuring fairness and preventing exploitation, though the reality on the ground must have varied greatly. Religion and the Sun King. Religious thought during the Old Kingdom saw important developments, especially in the relationship between the king and the gods. While earlier kings were closely associated with Horus, the falcon god, the fourth dynasty witnessed a growing emphasis on the sun god, often called Ra. Kings began calling themselves Son of Ra, a title that highlighted a new theological focus. This solar theology linked the king's role to the daily journey of the sun across the sky and its regenerative passage through the underworld at night. Just as the sun rose each morning, so the king, through proper rituals and burial, would be renewed and maintain cosmic order. Solar temples, separate from pyramids but conceptually related, appeared as places where the sun god could be honored in his own right, further strengthening this connection. Burial practices and ideas about the afterlife also evolved. For much of the Old Kingdom, the fullness of the afterlife was a privilege closely associated with the king and his family. Texts and rituals emphasized the king's journey to the sky to join the gods, especially in celestial regions. Over time, aspects of royal afterlife ideology began to filter downward, allowing high officials to adopt some royal motifs and expectations, though not on the same scale. The interplay of royal and popular religion is complex. Official theology stressed the king's unique role as mediator with the divine, but ordinary people continued to worship local gods, household deities, and ancestors. The state tended to integrate these practices into a broader framework, rather than suppress them, creating a layered religious landscape in which royal, local, and personal piety overlapped. Art, literature, and cultural expression The Old Kingdom established many of the artistic conventions that would define Egyptian culture for centuries. Reliefs and statuary followed strict rules about proportions, poses, and perspectives. Figures were often shown in composite view, with heads and legs in profile, but torsos facing forward. This was not a matter of lack of skill, but a deliberate choice, meant to present the most characteristic angle of each body part, and thereby communicate essential qualities. Tomb art, in particular, flourished. In the mastaba tombs of officials near royal pyramids, wall scenes depicted a range of activities: farming, hunting, fishing, craft production, feasting, and ritual. These images were not simple snapshots of daily life. They were idealized, ordered versions meant to ensure that the deceased would have access to all necessary goods and experiences in the afterlife. They also conveyed status, showing the tomb owner as the organizer and beneficiary of all this activity. Writing began to move beyond purely administrative context into more elaborate funerary and religious roles. The earliest phases of what would later become the pyramid texts, spells and utterances meant to protect the king and guide him in the afterlife, appeared at the end of the Old Kingdom. These texts provide valuable insight into Egyptian views of death, the soul, and the structure of the cosmos, revealing a rich and sometimes complex mythology. Foreign relations and expeditions. Although the Old Kingdom is often portrayed as inward-looking, it maintained active contacts with neighboring regions. Egyptian expeditions went to Sinai to mine copper and turquoise, to the eastern desert for stone, and south along the Nile for gold, ivory, and exotic goods. Reliefs and inscriptions from this period occasionally depict foreign peoples, Nubians, Libyans, and those from the Levant, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as enemies or tribute bearers. These contacts served both practical and ideological purposes. Practically, they supplied materials that the Nile Valley lacked and allowed the state to equip its projects and elite with luxury goods. Ideologically, they reinforced the image of the king as lord of the two lands and beyond, a ruler whose reach extended into foreign territories. Scenes of foreigners bringing tribute to the king appear in tombs and temples, symbolizing Egypt's place at the center of a larger world. The military dimension of these relations is harder to reconstruct in detail, but the need to protect trade routes and resources must have prompted campaigns and fortification efforts. The state's capacity to project power beyond its borders further testified to its internal organization and the king's prestige. The decline of the Old Kingdom. By the late 6th dynasty, signs of strain appeared within the Old Kingdom system. Several factors likely contributed to its decline. Changes in climate and Nile flood levels may have disrupted agriculture, leading to food shortages and social tension. At the same time, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of provincial officials and temple estates may have weakened central authority. As provincial elites built increasingly elaborate tombs and claimed grand titles, the image of the king as uniquely powerful may have eroded. If local leaders began to act more independently, the state's ability to mobilize labor and resources on a national scale would diminish. Internal succession disputes or the rise of powerful court factions could have further destabilized the monarchy. Eventually, the centralized system that had sustained pyramid building and strong royal control could no longer function effectively. The Old Kingdom gave way to a period of political fragmentation and regional rule, often called the First Intermediate Period. In this era, different centers claimed royal authority, and the unity of the two lands fractured. Yet even as central power collapsed, the cultural and administrative patterns established during the early Dynastic and Old Kingdom periods continued to influence local rulers and communities. The legacy of the early Dynastic and Old Kingdom periods. The early Dynastic and Old Kingdom periods created the template for Egyptian civilization. They defined kingship as a sacred institution tasked with maintaining cosmic and social order. They developed a complex bureaucracy capable of managing large-scale projects and long-distance trade. They established artistic and religious conventions, pyramids, hieroglyphs, divine kings, the concept of maat that would endure for millennia. Later Egyptians looked back on the Old Kingdom as a kind of golden age, a time when the king's power was at its height, and monumental achievements like the pyramids proved Egypt's central place in the universe.
Even when political structures changed, the memory of these early centuries remained a powerful reference point. New dynasties could legitimize themselves by linking their reigns to the ideals and monuments of this foundational era.
For your larger project, this section bridges the transition from the formative, largely prehistoric world of pre-dynastic Egypt to the fully articulated state and culture that most people imagine when they think of ancient Egypt. In the next sections, you can explore how this state-weathered crisis reassembled itself and evolved through the Middle and New Kingdoms, foreign invasions, and eventually into Hellenistic and Roman periods. Section 2 expanded, Early Dynastic and Old Kingdom. See 3100-218-1 BCE, Unification Revisited, Myth, Memory, and Archaeology. The idea that Egypt was unified around 3100 BCE under a single founding king is one of the most famous elements of its history. Later Egyptian tradition, echoed by Greek writers, spoke of an early ruler, often identified as Menes, who brought together Upper and Lower Egypt. Archaeology, however, suggests that unification was a gradual process involving multiple generations of rulers who fought, negotiated, and symbolically asserted their authority over the two lands. Monuments like the Narmer palette discovered at Hierakonpolis depict a king wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, subduing enemies and overseeing rows of decapitated foes. Whether this represents a single decisive event or a stylized summary of a long campaign, it shows how early kings wanted to be remembered, as conquerors who imposed order on a divided land. The iconography, standards, intertwined creatures, and the juxtaposition of crowns turns political consolidation into a cosmic act. Other early royal objects confirm that this shift was not only military but ideological. Seals, labels, and small inscriptions mention kings, whose names appear in later king lists, linking the emerging states' rulers into a remembered sequence. Already, in these earliest records, there is a sense that Egypt's past and present form a continuous line of divine kingship, even if the details have been simplified and idealized. Early dynastic capitals, Memphis and Abydos. The political geography of the early dynastic state revolved around two key centers, Memphis in the north and Abydos in the south. Memphis, located near the point where Upper Egypt's narrow valley opens into the delta, was ideally placed as an administrative and logistical hub. Tradition later credited its foundation to the unifier king, and it remained a political center for much of Egyptian history.
From Memphis, the king and his court could monitor traffic along the Nile, oversee the distribution of goods, and communicate with both northern and southern provinces. Administrative buildings, palaces, and storage facilities probably clustered around this core, though much of the early material is lost or buried beneath later constructions and modern development.
Abydos, by contrast, functioned primarily as a royal burial and cult center in the early dynastic period. The kings of the first dynasty and many of the second chose to be buried there, in large tombs surrounded by subsidiary graves and ritual enclosures. Abydos thus became a place where the royal dead anchored the legitimacy of the living kings. Over time, it would also become associated with Osiris, god of the dead, adding another layer to its sacred character. The interplay between Memphis and Abydos administrative north, ancestral south, mirrored the larger duality of Egyptian geography and ideology. The king ruled from a practical center near the delta, but drew spiritual and historical strength from a southern acropolis that tied him to his predecessors and to the enduring land of Upper Egypt. Writing and the birth of Egyptian administration. One of the most transformative developments of the early dynastic period was the establishment of writing as a permanent tool of governance. Early inscriptions appear on small tags attached to goods in royal tombs, on seals used to mark jars and doors, and on ceremonial objects. These short texts record names, titles, quantities, and occasionally brief phrases, indicating that writing was used to track offerings, taxes, and administrative transactions. The Egyptian script combined pictorial signs, hieroglyphs, with phonetic values, allowing the recording of both concrete items and personal names. While the system's origins lie in the pre-dynastic period, it was in the early dynastic era that writing became an integral part of the state apparatus. Scribes, trained to master this complex script, formed a specialized class. Their work made it possible to extend royal authority across distance and time, ensuring that orders, inventories, and records could be consulted and enforced. Writing also had a symbolic dimension. Hieroglyphs themselves were seen as potent, almost magical. To inscribe a king's name on stone or to carve a scene with accompanying text was not just to describe reality, but to help sustain it. Over the centuries, this belief would lead to elaborate religious and funerary texts, but its roots lie in the early recognition that signs on stone and papyrus could shape the world as well as record it. Law, justice, and the concept of maat. Although detailed legal codes from the early dynastic period do not survive, later texts suggest that ideas about law and justice were already firmly tied to the king's role as upholder of maat. Maat, often personified as a goddess, represented the underlying order of the universe, truth, balance, and the proper relationships among people, gods, and nature. The king, as the human embodiment of maat, was responsible for ensuring fair distribution of resources, punishing wrongdoing, and maintaining harmony. In practice, local officials and village councils must have handled most disputes, applying customary law and precedents. Serious cases, conflicts between regions, and matters involving temple or royal property would have required higher-level intervention. The existence of hierarchies of officials, judges, viziers, and other titled figures implies a system in which appeals, investigations, and judgments flowed upward when necessary. The ideal was that no one, not even powerful officials, stood entirely above maat. In later periods, tomb inscriptions boast that the tomb owner did not favor the great over the small or did not take the orphan's property, echoing principles that likely emerged early in Egyptian thought. Even if the reality often fell short of these ideals, the rhetoric itself reveals a conception of justice that encompassed both cosmic and everyday concerns. Architecture before the pyramids, mastabas and palaces. Long before the first pyramids rose on the horizon, the early dynastic period produced impressive architectural forms that laid the groundwork for later developments. The typical non-royal elite tomb of this time was the mastaba, a low rectangular structure with sloping sides and a flat roof, built of mud brick and sometimes faced with stone. Inside, a shaft descended to the burial chamber, while rooms above ground held offerings and perhaps served as chapels for the cult of the deceased. Mastabas for high officials clustered in semesters near royal centers, reflecting both their proximity to the king and their importance within the state. Their walls might bear early reliefs or painted decorations, and their layout included false doors, symbolic thresholds through which the deceased would receive offerings from the living. The architectural vocabulary of niches, chapels, and offering spaces would be refined in later periods, but was already present in embryonic form. Our knowledge of royal palaces in this era is more limited, as these structures, built in mud, brick, and wood, rarely survive. But scenes on seals and later representations suggest complexes with courtyards, audience halls, storage areas, and residential quarters. The king's palace was both a practical administrative center and a stage for royal ceremony, where audiences, festivals, and diplomatic receptions expressed the hierarchy and stability of the new state. The Third Dynasty and the innovation of stone. The transition from the Second to the Third Dynasty marks a key shift: the large-scale use of stone in monumental architecture. Although stone had been used for small objects and some building elements earlier, it was under Djoser, the second king of the Third Dynasty, that architects attempted to create an entire complex, largely in stone. Djoser's step pyramid complex at Saqqara represents a bold leap. Initially conceived as a traditional mastaba, it was expanded and transformed into a stepped structure, with multiple layers rising one above the other. Around it, a walled complex contained courtyards for festivals, imitation palaces, shrines representing different regions of Egypt, and various ceremonial spaces. The architect, traditionally named Imhotep, appears to have reimagined the royal tomb as a stone version of the king's earthly estate, ensuring that he had everything he needed for eternity. The use of finely cut stone blocks, carefully fitted together, required new techniques and organization. Quarrying, transporting, and shaping these blocks on a large scale demanded a high degree of planning and labor management. Djoser's complex demonstrated that the state could marshal such resources and inspired subsequent kings to pursue even larger and more ambitious projects. The Old Kingdom pyramid age in detail. The Fourth Dynasty saw the culmination of royal pyramid building, particularly on the Giza Plateau. The early experimentation of the Third Dynasty gave way to a more standardized, yet increasingly monumental form. Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, built multiple pyramids, including the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid, with its change of angle partway up, reveals architectural learning and progress. The Red Pyramid, with its consistent slope, shows that the builders had achieved a stable formula. Khufu, Sneferu's successor, commissioned the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest stone pyramid ever built. Its precise alignment with the cardinal points, massive scale, and complex internal chambers testified to the organizational and technical capabilities of the Old Kingdom state. Khafre and Menkaure, Khufu's successors, added their own slightly smaller pyramids at Giza, along with valley temples, causeways, and subsidiary structures. The Great Sphinx, commonly associated with Khafre, combines royal and solar symbolism in a single monumental figure. These pyramid complexes were not isolated monuments. They were parts of broader sacred landscapes. Each complex included a valley temple near the Nile, connected by a causeway to a mortuary temple near the pyramid, where daily rituals for the kings, Ka, were performed. Towns of workers, officials, and priests developed nearby, creating permanent communities devoted to the maintenance of the royal fate. How the pyramids were built, organization, and labor. The question of how the pyramids were built has fascinated people for centuries. While many details remain debated, certain points are clear enough to outline the social and economic framework behind their construction. Labor appears to have been organized in rotating teams, not permanently enslaved masses. Archaeological evidence of workers' villages near the pyramids, complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and orderly housing, suggests a system in which crews served, for set periods, then returned to their home villages. These crews were likely farmers fulfilling corvée service during the flood season, when fields were underwater and agricultural work was reduced. The state supplied food, clothing, and tools, and team leaders coordinated tasks such as quarrying, hauling, and setting blocks. Skilled masons, surveyors, and architects played key roles in planning and quality control. The pyramids thus represent not only engineering prowess, but also a sophisticated social system in which thousands of individuals contributed through coordinated effort. The logistics of feeding and housing the workforce also spurred improvements in agriculture and distribution. The pyramids, in this sense, were engines of economic mobilization, channeling surplus into monumental form. They symbolized state power, but they were also products of genuine collaboration between rulers and subjects who shared, at some level, the belief that the king's eternal well-being was bound up with the country's prosperity. Non-royal tombs and the spread of elite ideology. While the pyramids dominate the skyline, the mastaba tombs of officials around royal necropolae are equally important for understanding Old Kingdom society. These tombs, often elaborately decorated, offer detailed scenes of daily life, biographies, and representations of the tomb owners' families and estates. These depictions served multiple purposes. They asserted the tomb owner's status and achievements, listing titles, honors, and acts of generosity. They functioned magically, ensuring that the depicted activities and offerings would be eternally available in the afterlife. They created visual records of crafts, agriculture, hunting, music, and ritual that today provide rich information on Old Kingdom culture. In these tombs, we see the spread of certain royal themes, such as the smiting pose, processions of offerings, and depictions of foreign tribute, into non-royal contexts. This borrowing reflects the diffusion of royal ideology. Elite officials align themselves with the king's image and responsibilities, presenting themselves as loyal servants who mirrored royal virtues at a smaller scale. At the same time, these tombs show a growing sense of individual identity. Tomb owners speak in the first person, recounting how they judged fairly, divided food during famine, or built monuments. This autobiographical voice, while formulaic, suggests a developing conception of personal legacy alongside collective and royal memory. The Old Kingdom economy, agriculture, craft, and trade. The economic foundation of the Old Kingdom rested on agriculture, particularly cereal cultivation along the Nile's fertile floodplain. Land was categorized as royal, temple, or private, though in practice, the king had overarching claims. Estates managed by officials or temples produced grain, vegetables, flax, and animal products, which were collected as taxes or offerings and redistributed as rations to workers, priests, and dependents. Craft production flourished in both centralized and local settings. Rural workshops produced fine stone vessels, metal tools, jewelry, and ceremonial objects, while village artisans created pottery, textiles, and everyday tools. Some craftsmen, such as skilled sculptors and scribes, enjoyed special status and could become significant figures in the administrative apparatus. Trade supplemented local resources. From the south, via Nubia, came gold, ebony, ivory, and exotic animal products. From the Sinai and eastern deserts came copper, turquoise, and hard stone. Contacts with the Levant brought timber, wine, oils, and perhaps certain luxury items. These exchanges could occur through formal expeditions led by royal officials, as attested by inscriptions, or through more informal, local interactions. The king's role in these economic networks was central. He authorized expeditions, claimed a share of imported wealth, and redistributed goods to temples and officials. The smooth functioning of this system depended on stable governance, regular Nile floods,
and the ability to deter or manage external threats.
Religion deepens, royal and popular beliefs. As the Old Kingdom progressed, religious ideas and practices became more elaborate and structured. The king's divine status was emphasized through increasingly formal rituals, titles, and temple cults. He was seen as the living Horus, the son of Ra, and the guarantor of cosmic order. Festivals and ceremonies at temples and palace complexes dramatized these roles, integrating local communities into a unified religious framework. At the popular level, Egyptians continued to venerate local gods, household deities, and ancestors. Small figurines, amulets, and simple shrines attest to a vibrant domestic religiosity that coexisted with grand state cults. The boundaries between official and popular religion were porous. Local gods could be absorbed into the state pantheon, while royal cults influenced village rituals. Ideas about the afterlife also developed. In the earliest phases, full participation in the celestial afterlife may have been reserved for the king, whose pyramid texts, inscribed in the burial chambers of late Old Kingdom pyramids, describe his ascent to the sky in union with the gods. Over time, aspects of this royal afterlife vision began to trickle down to noble and wealthy individuals, setting the stage for the broader democratization of the afterlife in later periods. The end of the Old Kingdom, causes and consequences. The collapse of the Old Kingdom was not a sudden, singular event, but the culmination of several overlapping crises. Among the factors often considered are environmental stress. Evidence suggests that Nile floods may have become less predictable or lower on average, leading to poor harvests and famine. Fiscal strain. The enormous costs of pyramid building, temple endowments, and elite benefactions may have overburdened the state's resources. Provincial power, governors, nomarchs, and other regional elites accumulated land, wealth, and local authority, becoming semi-autonomous and less responsive to central control. Succession issues, short reigns, possible disputes within the royal family, and weaker kings reduced the monarchy's ability to manage crises. As central authority waned in the late 6th dynasty, local power holders began to act more independently. Pyramid building ceased and royal projects shrank in scale. In some regions, there may have been periods of lawlessness or neglect. Yet, even as the Old Kingdom's integrated state dissolved, its institutions did not disappear entirely. Provincial elites, priests, and local administrators continued to use the ideological and administrative tools inherited from the Old Kingdom, adapting them to a more fragmented world. The period that followed, the First Intermediate Period, would see competition between different centers and attempts to articulate new visions of just kingship and social order. But those visions were rooted in Old Kingdom experiences, lessons learned from both its achievements and its failures. The enduring legacy of the early Dynastic and Old Kingdom periods. By the time the Old Kingdom ended, Egypt had already established many of the patterns that would define its civilization. A conception of kingship that combined divine authority, military leadership, and responsibility for justice. A bureaucratic apparatus built on literacy and hierarchy, capable of mobilizing labor and managing resources. Artistic and architectural conventions, pyramids, mastabas, composite view reliefs that remained reference points for centuries. Religious ideas about maat, the afterlife, and the relationship between gods and humans that would evolve but never fundamentally vanish. Later Egyptians looked back on this era with awe. The pyramids in particular stood as visible reminders of a time when kings seemed almost godlike in their power to shape stone and society. Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom rulers often harked back to Old Kingdom forms and titles, trying to align themselves with that remembered Golden Age. Next, we will be exploring First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom circa 2181 through 1650 BCE, joined by our resident Egyptian expert. See you next time on Blind History with Josh Berry.